I'm Richard Barnett, and this is Sun Street Passage. London, one street at a time. East Anglian skies are proverbially immense, and the one above me this morning is no exception. It's vast, but also deep, layered in the way that Constable or Cotman might have arranged it, with purple-black storm clouds to set off the rich green of the trees that line the river. Flag irises pop out in buttery yellow. Coots and their chicks peep to one another, darting over the water like clockwork toys. Sitting on a riverside bench, I've stretched my legs out over a cobbled towpath, and a colourful line of houseboats occupy the bank downriver. The Saliana, the Arcadia, the Bluebell, and the alarmingly named Valhalla Rising. A few steps away, two ranges of ancient buildings, with a Georgian bell tower and rows of cream-painted sash windows, gather around a brick-paved quad. Through the open windows, you might catch a glimpse of students sitting their summer exams. A few minutes after I arrived, I heard those heart-fluttering words, "You may turn over your papers now," followed by a rustling of A4 and a collective sigh. Where are we? Paradise, evidently. But which one? This might be Laundress Green in Cambridge, one of the best places in the world to sit with a drink and lose yourself in an Arcadian reverie, watching the sun set over the backs and the swallows swooping down over the Cam. But that isn't the tower of Queen's College. It's a new-build apartment block in green-tinted concrete. And that isn't a punt. It's a half-submerged fiberglass dinghy full of coffee cups and empty vapes. And this isn't a glass of claret from the college cellars. It's a can of Coke Zero from the Tesco just across the bridge. This isn't Cambridge, or even Oxford, but it is a kind of Arcadia. We've come to Three Mills Island, on the River Lee in East London, a mile or two upstream from its confluence with the Thames. For centuries the Lee served as a boundary between Middlesex and Essex. So this is East Anglia in one sense. In the last couple of decades, this part of East London has become synonymous with regeneration, not least through the 2012 Olympic Park just to the north. But alchemy, the transformation of one thing into another, might be a better word for the stories Three Mills Island has to tell us. An isolated marsh becomes an East End factory, which becomes in turn an East Anglian village green. Essex grain breeds oblivion and then misery for the inhabitants of Hogarth's and Dickens's London. Conkers are transformed into high explosives destined for the Somme. An architectural masterpiece is reduced to rubble on the bed of an industrial waterway. 19th century mill hands reappear as 21st century school children. Victorian warehouses host pop culture icons and their retinues. A post-industrial cityscape is reinvented as a dormitory for the arty bourgeoisie. And an ill-assorted set of housemates find themselves mythologized as characters in a new national epic. Let's go for a walk and meet them all. The beginning of our journey to Three Mills Island could hardly be less Arcadian. Step out of Bromley by Bow Station, and you're faced with as exhilaratingly bleak a piece of J.G. Ballard as you'll find in modern London. This is the northern approach to the Blackwall Tunnel under the Thames. It's a roadscape of tremendous restlessness, not deafening but penetrating, a kind of vehicular ambient of which Brian Eno might be proud, and which rivals the long-player sound installation at Trinity Buoy Wharf for sheer endurance. New apartment blocks, many faced with that Weimar expressionist brick which is so much in vogue these days, dominate the skyline on both sides of the expressway, along with the wading bird silhouettes of cranes. Our eyes find some relief in the nest of Victorian gas holders on the far side of the Lee, more on these shortly, and the jaunty nets enclosing sports pitches on the roof of the new Bow School. And above all this, that gigantic sky, and the feeling of London opening out as it looks to the east. We descend a flight of steps on the far side of the station, past an almost theatrical assemblage of overflowing bins, past a wire mesh fence of Stasi-esque severity, and venture through an underpass. On the far side of the endless traffic, we hurry through another new development, Leaside Lock, which does what it can with more Weimar brick and some satisfyingly rounded Art Deco corners, towards Arcadia. 3 Mill Lane, the spine of our walk today, begins at a junction between a Tesco and an old pub done up in black as a nightclub. The first 100 metres or so runs between the Tesco and its car park, and, as so often in London, it's all surprisingly green. The car park is lined with hedges and flower beds, and a lush growth of buddleia and rosebay willow herb has grown up in the gap between a dilapidated fence and a corrugated iron shed. Above a line of trees to the east, we get promising glimpses of a red-tiled roof studded with dormer windows, a gilded weather vane, and what appears to be the white-painted caps of a pair of oast houses. As we pass the last row of cars and the willows beyond them, we find ourselves cast back into an 18th century Essex village. A river flows lazily beneath 2 iron bridges, one bright with very modern graffiti. A mill pond stands empty and glistening at low tide, and beyond it the Georgian mill buildings are assembled around their courtyard. Our walk will carry us through the heart of the mill complex, but we'll pause for a moment on the bridge and reflect on the shifting relationship between land and water in this part of London. Let's begin with the poets. In The Fairy Queen, written in the 1590s and described by an exasperated Philip Larkin as the dullest thing out, Edmund Spenser assembles a procession to mark the marriage of the Thames and the Medway. After a parade of mythical bigwigs and noble rivers, the fertile Nile, Tigris fierce, great Ganges, the little tributaries of the Thames pay tribute to their lord. Almost at the end of the queue, we encounter the wanton Lee that oft doth lose his way. A century or so later, in his poem Windsor Forest, Alexander Pope pulled a similar move, making the gulfy Lee rear his sedgy tresses in honour of old Father Thames. Pushing through the thickets of pastoral verbiage, we have a recognisable portrait of the river in front of us. A wandering, looping watercourse full of deep pools grown up with grass and reeds. The Lee rises in the Chiltern Hills near Luton and follows a meandering route through Hertford, Great Amwell, where Isaac Walton fished its waters in the decades around the Civil War, and Waltham Abbey. Here begins what Londoners think of as the Lee Valley, a stretch of reservoirs, warehouses and industrial estates running south to the Thames at Blackwall. The Lee has always been a working river in several senses. As we've seen, this is traditionally where Middlesex met Essex. In a treaty signed in the late 9th century, it also marks part of the boundary between the Danelaw, under Viking control, to the north and east, and Alfred the Great's territories to the south and west. In the 890s, the Vikings broke the treaty. A party of marauders under the chieftain Hastein took their ships up the Lee, imagine a dragon-prowed longship nosing under the District Line Bridge today, and made a fortified camp 20 miles upstream. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Alfred's troops confronted them and forced them to leave, perhaps by blocking the river with fallen trees, but one interpretation has them digging a new channel to drain the river and leave the longships stranded. 2 centuries after Alfred's death, in the Domesday Book of 1086, we find the earliest references to mills on the Lee. For most of its history, the lower Lee was tidal, rising and falling with the Thames estuary, and the millers used this constant ebb and flow to turn great water wheels and drive their millstones. By the middle of the 12th century, these lands were held by the Cistercian Abbey at Stratford Langthorne, half a mile northeast of here, now beneath an immense London Underground depot. Tidal mills on this spot ground grain for the Abbey's bakery, and surplus flour was sold to the bakers at Stratford-at-Bow, whose loaves helped to satisfy the ravenous appetites of the city. At the time of the Spanish Armada, another mill here on the Lee made gunpowder, for the cannons of Francis Drake's galleons. But speaking of the Lee here is something of a misnomer. Look at a map of Three Mills Island, and you'll see it embedded in a varicose web of waterways, all with picturesque names. Pudding Mill River, Waterworks River, Abbey Creek, Prescott Channel. These are the Bow Back Rivers, and their history is as tangled as their geography. The monks of Stratford Langthorne, or rather their peasant labourers, set out to improve their estates by draining the marshes at Stratford and digging new channels for mills. These efforts continued in one form or another for centuries. Indeed, Three Mills Island only really became an island in the 1930s, with the digging of the Prescott Channel on the far side of the mills. Some of the regeneration funds from the 2012 Olympics were used to restore the channel and build a lock, and there's talk of using the head of water behind it for generating electricity. The new lock, plus the weir just upstream of the mills, makes Three Mills Island the tidal limit of the modern Lee. So we're not only sojourners in Arcadia, we're also enjoying a day out at the seaside. Crossing the bridge, we take our first steps onto the eastern bank of the Lee. These days, Greater London has pushed its jurisdiction well beyond the river, but with a nod to Alfred the Great, we'll stretch a point and call this Essex. To get the most striking and the most revealing view, let's take a few steps along the thin finger of land separating the Lee from the Bow-back rivers. At low tide, we can appreciate the grandeur and the sheer strangeness of the mill complex. Vertical plains of fibrous green weed rise from the mud, resolving into walls of weather-beaten brick and a thrillingly irregular skyline of cupolas, cones and weatherboarded hoists. The clock mill, with its bell tower and hooded kilns, is the eye-catcher of the pair, but the house mill, on the northern side of Three Mill Lane, has secrets of its own. From here, we can see that this well-proportioned chunk of Augustan understatement rests on something like a brutalist chapel, an austere nave of concrete columns through which the river flows. This void would once have housed 4 immense water wheels, which drove 12 pairs of millstones. Seeing this balancing act gives you tremendous respect for the Lee Tidal Mill Trust, which restored the mills in the 1990s. How on earth did they do it, without all this brickwork just falling into the water? The earliest surviving foundations on the site are thought to date from the 13th or 14th centuries. But most of the buildings we can see are Georgian, and they were built on profits from one of the grimmest episodes in London's history. Leaf through the Newgate calendar or the proceedings of the Old Bailey for any year in the second quarter of the 18th century, and you'll find dozens of cases of robbery, assault and even murder fuelled by gin. The roots of the gin craze lay in a piece of high politics at the end of the 17th century. In 1690, William of Orange signed an act for encouraging the distilling of brandy and spirits from corn. In doing so, William sought to increase demand for English grain, keep his aristocratic supporters rich, and hence retain his new throne. He also, inadvertently, flooded his kingdom's cities, especially London, with strong, cheap alcohol, much of which was turned into gin. By the early 18th century, gin was scorch gut, strip me naked, kill me quick, a moral, medical and mercantile disaster played out on the streets of the capital. It consumed vast quantities of good English grain to produce nothing more than a street drug cut with industrial byproducts. Fathers drank away their wages, leaving their families destitute. Mothers quieted their children with gin-laced possets, and some infants met violent ends through the drunken neglect of their nurses. Contemporary statistics showed a dramatic rise in gin consumption from the first years of the 18th century, peaking in 1743. Public fears were expressed in pamphlets, plays and caricatures, most famously William Hogarth's Gin Lane. And political concern was reflected in 8 Acts of Parliament, known collectively as the Gin Acts, passed between 1729 and 1751. We'll return to the story of the gin craze another time, and pay a visit to its most notorious neighbourhood. But the story of Three Mills Island shows that, In a rather brutal sense, William of Orange was right. If you had money to invest and a nose for business, the gin craze could be exceedingly profitable. In 1728, Peter Lefebvre, a flour merchant of Huguenot descent, bought the mills here. He went into partnership with two Huguenot distillers, Daniel Bisson and John Debonair, and together they established the Three Mills distillery. By the middle of the century, the mill stood at the centre of a small industrial village, with barrel makers, a windmill to augment the water wheels, and even a farm to fatten pigs with leftover mash. Bisson, the son of a Spitalfields weaver, lived long enough to acquire the distillery and in 1776 rebuild the house mill, which is celebrating its 250th birthday this year. As we pass the mill, we can see a plaque with Bisson's initials and what may or may not be his coat of arms set into the brickwork. So imagine Bisson's new distillery, bustling with activity on a spring day a couple of centuries ago. The rich, malty scent of the fermenting mash, gusts of steam and a headier smell from the distilling house, the clattering of hooves and the shouts of apprentice mill hands as they unload sacks of grain, the happy grumbling of pigs rootling in their troughs, hammer blows and the occasional curse from the cooper's yard, and beneath it all the steady rumble of the water wheels under our feet. The south side of the courtyard is occupied by the clock mill, first built in 1753, destroyed by fire, and then rebuilt in 1817 by the distiller and MP Philip Metcalfe. Metcalfe seems to have had more fun than you might expect from a Tory industrialist. He was a friend of Samuel Johnson and Fanny Burney, an executor of Joshua Reynolds' will, and a member of the Society of Dilettanti. His clock tower is a marvellous oversized chess piece, a white-painted dome held up on columns, as upright and formal as Mr. Darcy, perched on a brick octagon and a plain square base, with naughty Gothic-pointed windows set into them. This kind of witty, stylistic mash-up infuriated the High Victorians, but to my eye it's delicious, especially with the no-nonsense geometric bulk of the kilns rising up behind it. By the middle of the 19th century, the market for gin was booming. Though the gin craze had been over for almost a century, the kind of grinding, hopeless poverty which had driven Londoners to gin could now be found throughout the new industrial cities, and indeed in the slums of the East End. And gin was still relatively cheap. A quarter pint of gin might cost threepence halfpenny, compared with twopence for a pint of beer. London streets were thronged with a new kind of gin shop, known with a certain Dickensian irony as the Gin Palace. For the emerging temperance movement, gin was a vile and degrading venom, but at the same time it was gaining a place on more respectable sideboards and drinks cabinets, partly because of a change in the character of the spirit itself. Well into the 19th century, even the largest pot stills were no more than scaled-up versions of the alchemist's alembics. Filled with wort and sealed for each shot, they had to be emptied and cleaned regularly, and the quality of spirit they produced was highly variable. In 1831, the Franco-Irish exciseman-turned-distiller Aeneas Coffey patented a new continuous still. Wort and steam could be fed in continuously, with no breaks for replenishment, and the resulting spirit was consistent and clean-tasting. Within a few years, British distillers adopted the coffee still, turning gin manufacture from a craft into a mass-production industry, but also altering the nature of their product. 18th century pot still spirits were usually rough, requiring a heavy mixture of botanicals and plenty of sugar to make a palatable drink. But spirit from a coffee still required no masking or sweetening, and over a generation or so, distillers evolved a new style, lighter and fresher, known as London Dry Gin. In 1872, the distillers J. and W. Nicholson acquired the Three Mills distillery and installed a coffee still. Alcohol distilled here was taken to their headquarters on St. John's Street in Clerkenwell, where it was turned into Lamplighter, one of the most enduringly popular brands of London dry gin. Ironically enough, the principles behind the coffee still helped to kickstart the chemical industry, making Lamplighter a kissing cousin of the stink factories that sprung up along the Lee Valley in the 19th and early 20th centuries. This connection may not sound like much, but it gave Three Mills Island a surprisingly close link with the turbulent geopolitics of the 20th century. In the aftermath of the 1915 shell crisis, a shortage of artillery ammunition, which led to the fall of the Asquith government and the rise to power of Lloyd George, the British military establishment sought to increase production of high explosives. One choke point was the production of acetone, now most familiar as the smelly part of nail polish remover, but an essential raw material in many industrial processes. Chaim Weizmann, a Belarusian-born chemist teaching at Manchester University, identified a microorganism that secreted acetone as a byproduct of fermentation. In 1915, Weizmann came to the Three Mills distillery to set up a pilot plant for acetone production. His process used starch extracted from maize, but when maize stocks ran low, the British government called on children across the country to collect horse chestnuts as a substitute. Many of our great-grandparents likely spent an autumn afternoon doing their patriotic duty by picking up a paper bag full of Conkers. Working with 6 requisitioned distilleries, Weizmann's team had extracted 30,000 tonnes of acetone by the end of the war. Through his work with the British government, Weizmann, an ardent Zionist, met Arthur Balfour, Foreign Secretary and Conservative Prime Minister. Weizmann is credited with, and he certainly later claimed credit for, the 1917 Balfour Declaration, the first official statement of British support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. At the end of a long and tumultuous career, in February 1949, Weizmann became the first president of Israel. Today, the Clockhouse Mill is home to the Harris Science Academy, East London. A whiteboard outside the main entrance carries a timetable for this week's GCSE exams, so we'll tread softly as we pass the classroom windows. But what a place to go to school! I love a writing room in a Georgian mill by a river, and the school website claims, rather sweetly, that it's been a hub of resilience, productivity and innovation since 1135. But I wonder what 14-year-olds make of it. Do they crack dark jokes about Victorian child labour? 21st century London is not so much a city of factories, certainly not imposing brick edifices like these mills. Our consumer economy circulates mostly through plastic and aluminium warehouses on the fringes of the capital. It's hard to see them lasting a couple of centuries. And even harder to imagine the Londoners of 22-26 visiting them on a day out, as we might tour Quarry Bank or New Lanark, and marvelling at how we lived and worked. Short of a nuclear strike or a catastrophic inundation, I suspect the house mill and the clock mill will still be here. But what else we see and inhabit today will survive? The Tesco? The apartment blocks on Sugarhouse Island? The ArcelorMittal thing on the northern skyline at Stratford? But these speculations must go unanswered, as we find our path blocked by a high wall and a forbidding security gate. Let's pause here, no talking, exam conditions, and see if we can work out why Beyoncé, of all people, has paid a visit to Three Mills Island. Nicholson's kept the mills running well into the 20th century, but they also expanded the site, building new still houses and a bonded warehouse on empty ground to the west. Three Mills suffered badly in the 1940-41 Blitz, which left so much of London's eastern side a gap-toothed wasteland. Bombs damaged the mills and gutted the miller's house, and there are stories of a knee-deep tide of alcohol pouring down 3 Mill Lane into the river. After the war, the mills and the stills went quiet, but Nicholson's, the brewers Bass Charrington, and Hedges and Butler, spirit merchants to the British Crown no less, kept the warehouses open. Here they bottled blended whisky for the royal family, alongside Essex favourites like Bacardi. In the 70s, Hedges and Butler moved their operations away, and sought planning permission to flatten the near-derelict Three Mills distillery and turn it into a car park. Salvation came in the form of the Passmore Edwards Museum Trust, which took over the Georgian mill buildings and initiated a decades-long restoration. But the newer warehouses, large, quiet, secure spaces in what was then a disregarded part of the city, began to catch the eye of filmmakers. Several companies merged in the 90s to form 3 Mills Studios, and in 2004 the Greater London Authority's London Development Agency took over the studio complex. Since 2010, it's been owned by the London Legacy Development Company. Bureaucratic polysyllables aside, what's behind these high walls? 11 sound stages, 9 rehearsal rooms, capacious prop stores and workshops, and a long list of illustrious clients. Almost inevitably, Guy Ritchie shot sequences for Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels here, the movie that gave 1,000 posh boys the idea that they could do Vinnie Jones impressions. Dua Lipa, Lady Gaga and, yes, Beyoncé have all made music videos or rehearsed shows at 3 Mills. Danny Boyle prepared his opening and closing ceremonies for the 2012 Olympics here. The workshops have come to specialise in stop-motion animation. Tim Burton used 3 Mills for Frankenweenie and The Corpse Bride, and Wes Anderson made Isle of Dogs and Fantastic Mr. Fox here. And you've seen it on the telly, if you still watch telly, in ITV's London's Burning and Bad Girls, and the BBC's MasterChef and Crocodile Shoes. Anyone remember Jimmy Nail? And there's something else, something really famous. A George Orwell adaptation, was it? Never mind, perhaps something later on in our walk will remind me. As it faces the 3 Mills courtyard, the studio complex retains the impression of a factory. A high brick wall, great gates with lorries and people bustling in and out, and tall, unshowy buildings inside. We get a better view of the studio lot from the towpath around the island. The first thing we see, as we set off, is a stone set into the wall, recording the levels of 2 catastrophic floods in 1904 and 1928. Water, rising and falling, is never far away on 3 Mills Island, and the studio gates have flood defence barriers taller than I am. The front facing the Channel Sea River is taken up by a new range of studios, austere but pleasingly done in offset planes of hip artisan brick. Casting intricate shadows over the brickwork is an installation by the artist Zineb Sedira, which reproduces a quote from the director Federico Fellini. "Dreams are a language made of images. In cinema, every object and light means something, as in a dream." The studio backlot is nothing much to look at, but it's curiously thrilling to peer through a fence at something you're not really supposed to see. And one lives in hope of seeing a heavily guarded Madonna in sunglasses and a parka, stepping out of an unmarked transit van and looking around before nipping in through the back door of Stage 7. More exciting, aesthetically at least, is the view over the river. Low on the skyline, we can see a geometrical tangle of iron columns and girders, shifting and intersecting like a Bridget Riley painting as we walk past. These are the Bromley by Bow gas holders, built for the Imperial Gaslight and Coke Company in the 1870s. 2 of the 9 were destroyed in the Blitz, one leaving a vast and perfectly circular pool, and they've been redundant since the 70s, when coal gas gave way to its North Sea successor. But they're now Grade 2 listed, individually and collectively, and according to Historic England, they are among the most aesthetically distinguished and finely detailed gas holders ever built, with Doric and Corinthian capitals and filigree ironwork. Inevitably, there are proposals to redevelop the site as apartment blocks. But I hope they stay as they are for centuries to come, sublime and unreachable, a Stonehenge for the Anthropocene. Just past the new 3 Mills lock, the towpath brings us out into a huge and perfectly circular grassy green, surrounded by banks of earth, evoking the Roman amphitheatre at Cirencester, or even the Avebury Henge. As part of the Olympic Fringe Legacy project, the northern half of 3 Mills Island was landscaped as a park by the architects Churchman Thornhill Finch. It works beautifully. The grandeur of the circular green is balanced by a gentleness of contour and outline in the earthworks, and the whole thing is welcoming and plausibly organic. Just as I sit down to make some notes, 100 or so school children stream onto the green, having finished their morning exam. The sense of relief is palpable, and there's some horseplay and hooting, but most of them break up into little social circles, like a cocktail party, comparing notes and reassuring one another. Their relief, though, is only temporary, and after lunch I see them lining up to go back in for another exam. North of the green, the earthworks break down into tumuli and ridges that might be construed as fortifications or even barrows. Could this be a Sutton Hoo for Stratford? An Anglo-Saxon warlord, buried in his ship, beneath a mound, beside a river, at the boundary of two ancient kingdoms? Sadly not, but in some ways this is even better. It's the Wild Kingdom play space, created by We Made That. I'm usually rather suspicious of architect statements, but according to their website, they pursued a strategy of opportunism here, making the most of the play possibilities of the previously created landforms. The result is both admirable and tremendous fun, with rope walks, seesaws and giant steps made from railway sleepers, in a friendly and happily uncurated landscape. It's all fittingly maritime, recalling the spirit of post-war East End children playing games in the bombed ruins of warehouses and factories and dockyards. As I explore it, an elderly Muslim man in a taqiyya appears, pulling his granddaughters along on their scooters. They scamper off to swing on the ropes and pull each other up the giant steps, chattering and giggling. He settles on a bench and watches them, his face a picture of delight. At the northernmost tip of Three Mills Island, 2 footbridges lead to 2 very different versions of East London in 2026. One runs over to the Essex side, and a small estate of older houses, with a couple of 70s tower blocks rising behind them. Victorian terraces are something of a rarity in this part of town. The Luftwaffe and post-war redevelopment saw to that. This cluster of streets, surrounded by new developments, is a touching reminder of the patchwork history of the East End. From farmland, to factories and cheap housing for workers, to the punishing devastation of the Blitz, and post-war deindustrialisation, followed by waves of redevelopment and gentrification. The house mill and the clock mill are preserved remnants of a way of life, and long may they endure. But this is a way of life, going on between the expressways. Just by the bridge, a little urban garden has a hopscotch board like a late Matisse collage, and an Easter garden laid out by parishioners from Christchurch 3 Mills. The other bridge, Matilda's Bridge apparently, has a steel gate and a notice saying that access is restricted to fob holders between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. Over the water is Sugar House Island, almost an archetype of a certain kind of arty, luxury East End development. You can see something very similar on the Leamouth Peninsula and at Good Luck Hope by Trinity Buoy Wharf, both a mile or so south of here. There's a lot to say for these places. They occupy sites, often an island or a peninsula or a former dock, with a distinctive mood and an interesting history. They make an effort to acknowledge that history, even if it's usually slathered with marketing clichés. They're well made, with a lively mix of styles and profiles and building lines. The streets are full of lines and curves, with buildings offset and formed into tree-lined courts and squares. This makes them much more engaging to explore on foot than the usual rectilinear sterility. And they give the impression of a landscape which has been shaped over decades by many hands, not imposed by a single architect. A few surviving warehouses, though none from the sugar refinery which gave the development its name, have been preserved. And some of the new buildings are excellent. The primary school, the East London dance studios, the Faden offices on the riverside, with big picture windows and a demonstrative sawtooth roofline. If everyone in London could live like this, in stylish apartments with a good view, amenities and green spaces within walking distance, good transport links, who could possibly object? But they don't live like this, and I think that's the problem. From where I'm standing, Sugar House Island looks horribly like the modern urban equivalent of Marie Antoinette playing shepherdess in her fantasy village at Versailles. Even the streets have honest-to-goodness artisanal names: Zinc Street, Soapmaker Muse, Cooperage Yard, Copperworks Wharf. But this is not low-cost housing for honest-to-goodness artisans. It's half a square mile of luxury apartments for well-to-do Londoners who want to live on an island with something like a curfew, and who raise sweat by taking a spin class in the basement gym, not by heaving sacks of jute into the hold of a barge. Now who the hell am I to say this? I'm an outsider, only here for the day, unlike the folk who've actually bought apartments here. And it's not as if I've heaved much jute lately. But I am reminded of something Owen Hatherley wrote a couple of decades ago, standing close to this spot and watching the Olympic Park go up at Stratford. All of it, he wrote, is coming into being as an act against London, the creation of yet another security-obsessed, enclosed, gated enclave set up to mock the idea that we could become more rather than less equal. Let's turn south and follow the towpath back towards the mills. Another fleet of narrowboats fills the channel, and on the bank beside them a limestone hand reaches up from a plinth to grasp another disembodied hand. This faintly disconcerting memorial commemorates an industrial accident on the island in 1901, in which 4 men from the distillery, exploring an old sealed well, were overcome by fumes and died. Further down the towpath we rejoin 3 Mill Lane, but it seems our journey must come to an abrupt end. The lane crosses a gently arched cast-iron bridge onto Sugarhouse Island, but the southern half of the development is still under construction, and our way is blocked by a barrier and a hoarding. But let's make the best of it. From the bridge we can enjoy a panoramic view of the pool behind the house mill, lush with reeds and sedges, and the rear elevation of the miller's house, rebuilt in the 90s as a visitor centre, with a smart copper roof and a garden designed with local schoolchildren. Just beyond them is my favourite modern building in this landscape. It's another apartment block on the banks of the Lee, but this one subverts the prevailing wisdom of just going upwards. Staggered stories, pitched roof lines and tar-black walls give the impression that one of the fishermen's huts on the beach at Hastings came here, liked it and settled down to raise a family. For a place with such a long and vivid history, 3 Mills Island does not feel burdened by the past. The school and the studio, especially, seem full of life and looking to the future. But the island has a few ghosts, and before we leave, let's pay our respects to 2 revenants, not of people but of buildings. 2 singular structures which, in different ways, came to rest here, and which have exercised a remarkable hold on Londoners' imaginations. Follow the lane back into the mill courtyard, past the gates of 3 Mill Studios, past the new sound stages, along the towpath to the eastern corner of the island, almost in the shadow of those celebrated gas holders. The waterway in front of us, the Prescott Channel, was originally dug in the 1930s. But in the 1960s, the riverbed was reinforced with several hundred tons of rubble from a most notorious demolition job. Since 1838, the Euston Arch, a colossal porticoed gateway in millstone grit, had stood guard outside Euston Station. Despite a campaign led by John Betjeman and Nicholas Pevsner, the arch was pulled down in 1961 as part of the rebuilding of the station, an episode often credited with kick-starting the campaign to save Britain's then unfashionable Victorian heritage. But the arch lives on in the minds of Londoners, especially those of us inclined to architectural daydreaming. In 1996, the historian Dan Cruikshank started a campaign to rebuild the arch, and in 2009 some of its stones were recovered from the water here. There's a long way to go, but the Euston Arch may yet rise again. Now look across the river, over the bones of the Euston Arch, to the far bank. Another nondescript heap of earth, fenced off and grown up with weeds, is being edged into the water by an immense logistics park. In the early years of the new millennium, this was perhaps the most famous place in Britain, the site of the very first Big Brother house. Housemates entered and, once evicted, left across Davina's Bridge, now long gone, and camera cables ran across the river to a control room in 3 Mill Studios. After the second series, a new house was constructed at Elstree Studios. Under orders from Newham Council, the original one was taken down and the sight returned to nature. You may not be surprised to hear that I was not a Big Brother fan. In fact, I made rather a point of ignoring it, stuck-up little bugger that I was. But what struck me at the time, and what has stayed with me to this day, is the sheer inescapability of the show, and especially the housemates. People became obsessed with them, staying up into the small hours to watch the live feeds from the house, and the seemingly endless spin-offs in which commentators discuss the day's rivalries and allegiances and betrayals. Looking back at it, over a quarter of a century now, it really seems like an augury of what pop culture was to become in a new world of digital media. If Three Mills Island holds a Sutton Hoo and nearby an industrial Stonehenge, this spot is modern London's Mycenae, a lost citadel dedicated to the heroes and the villains of our new mythology. Craig Phillips, Jade Goody, Nasty Nick, they all rest here, in our collective memory at least, beneath the golden masks of modern celebrity. Let's hope they sleep well. I've posted pictures from my visit to 3 Mill Lane on the Sun Street Passage Instagram. If you'd like to visit, the best way to get there is Bromley by Bow Station, on the District and Hammersmith and City lines. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not make a donation to your favourite London charity? Mine, for what it's worth, is Coram, which has been supporting children in London and across the UK for almost 3 centuries. There's a link to the Coram website in the show notes, and they appreciate all donations, large or small. If you've really enjoyed it, we appreciate a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts. Next time, Privet, Poetic Souls, and the true home of the good life. See you there. Sun Street Passage is written and produced by me, Richard Barnett. Mean Free Path made the music and the art from Wenceslaus Holler's 1647 Long View of London. Thanks for listening.